Standing before the weathered stones of a medieval castle, it's hard not to feel a sense of awe. These colossal structures weren't just built to impress. They were designed to outlast centuries, outsmart armies, and outwit the laws of physics themselves. Think about it, without cranes, computers, or even basic blueprints, how did medieval engineers create fortresses so strong they still stand today? The answer lies in a hidden world of brilliance, where geometry met geology, where psychology shaped stone, and where every arch, every wall, every hidden passage was a calculated move in a high-stakes game of survival. This isn't just a story about castles. It's about the forgotten genius of the Middle Ages, a time when innovation wasn't just about invention. It was about reinventing the very idea of defense. Picture this: a castle isn't just a pile of rocks. It's a carefully crafted machine designed to exploit every advantage of its environment. The curve of a tower wasn't random. It was calculated to deflect projectiles. The thickness of a wall wasn't arbitrary. It was measured to withstand battering rams. Even the placement of windows was a strategic decision, blending light and shadow to keep defenders hidden while exposing attackers. These weren't just buildings, they were puzzles, each piece engineered to perfection. And the masterminds behind them, they weren't just stonemasons, they were mathematicians, geologists, even early psychologists, using every tool at their disposal to turn stone into an unbreakable shield. But here's the real secret. The science behind these castles wasn't just about strength, it was about fear. A castle's design was a form of psychological warfare, meant to intimidate before the first arrow was even fired. The sheer height of the walls, the labyrinth of narrow passageways, the echoing sound of footsteps in a cavernous gatehouse, every detail was engineered to unsettle, to overwhelm, to make an invading army think twice. And it worked, because the greatest weapon a castle ever had wasn't its walls or its archers. It was the illusion of invincibility. So join me as we step inside the minds of these medieval masterminds, uncovering the hidden science that turned stone into legend. By the end, you'll never look at a castle the same way again. The feudal system turned Europe into a patchwork of rival territories, where power was measured in walls and watchtowers. With no standing armies to rely on, lords needed fortresses that could hold out against raiders, rival nobles, even kings, because in this fractured world, every border was a battleground. And the stakes couldn't be higher. Lose your castle and you lost everything: your lands, your title, maybe even your life. That relentless pressure sparked an engineering revolution. Early motte and bailey castles, simple wooden towers perched on mounds, were no match for the siege weapons of the 12th century. But as attackers developed terrifying new tools like trebuchets, capable of hurling boulders the size of cattle, defenders answered with stone. And not just any stone. Engineers learned to quarry local bedrock, choosing limestone for its resilience or sandstone for easier carving, turning geology into a weapon. Walls grew thicker, sometimes reaching 15 feet, not just to withstand impacts, but to create deadly killing zones where attackers would be trapped between layers of defense. Arrow slits were angled to give archers sweeping fields of fire while leaving them nearly invisible from outside. Even staircases became weapons, spiraling clockwise to force right-handed invaders to fight uphill with their swords awkwardly pinned against the central pillar. This wasn't just building, it was chess played with chisels and mortar, where every innovation was a response to some new threat. And as castles spread from the rainy highlands of Scotland to the sun-baked cliffs of Syria, their designs adapted yet again, proving that the greatest engineering lesson of the Middle Ages was this: to survive, you didn't just need strong walls. You needed a mind sharp enough to outthink the next catastrophe. The land itself was the first line of defense, and medieval engineers knew it. Before a single stone was laid, builders would spend weeks surveying the terrain, reading the landscape like a battle map. A castle perched on a steep hill didn't just look imposing. It forced attackers to charge uphill through a hail of arrows, exhausting themselves before they even reached the walls. But elevation wasn't the only factor. Rivers and coastlines became natural moats, while forests provided timber for construction and fuel during sieges. Even the wind mattered. Strategically placed windows harnessed breezes to clear smoke from kitchens and forges, a subtle touch that kept defenders comfortable during long conflicts. Then came the stone. Every quarry told a story, and master builders became experts at reading it. Limestone, soft enough to carve intricate arrow loops and murder holes, had a hidden weakness. It crumbled under sustained bombardment. So engineers compensated with sheer mass, constructing walls so thick they could absorb the impact of siege engines. Meanwhile, granite castles rose taller and slimmer, their crystalline structure resisting erosion for centuries. Some builders got creative, repurposing ancient Roman ruins or even volcanic basalt columns, nature's ready-made fortress foundations. In Wales, you'll find castles clinging to cliffs like barnacles, their backs literally pressed against the rock face to eliminate blind spots. And in Scotland, the mighty Stirling Castle sits atop a volcanic crag, its foundations fused with the earth itself. But the true genius lay in how these elements work together. A high cliff might offer defense, but without a nearby spring, the castle would wither under siege. So engineers devised systems to channel rainwater into cisterns or tapped underground aquifers through wells so deep they doubled as secret escape routes. Even the color of the stone played a role. Sandstone blended with desert surroundings, making castles nearly invisible until attackers were dangerously close. This wasn't just construction, it was a dialogue between human ambition and the Earth's stubborn reality. The best castles didn't conquer the landscape, they became part of it, a lesson written in stone that still stands today. To build for eternity, you must first listen to the ground beneath your feet. Now, hidden beneath those rugged walls was another layer of brilliance, the precise geometry that turned piles of rock into mathematical masterpieces. Hidden within the rough-hewn stones of medieval castles lies a secret language of numbers, an invisible framework of mathematical precision that transformed brute strength into enduring grace. Architects didn't just build castles, they composed them, using ratios like the golden section to craft structures that were as pleasing to the eye as they were impenetrable. Picture a tower's silhouette against the horizon. Its height to width often followed the ratio of 1 to 1.618, a proportion found in seashells and sunflowers, believed to evoke an instinctive sense of balance and stability. This wasn't vanity, it was strategy. A castle that felt harmonious to the eye also unsettled attackers, its perfection hinting at unshakable order amidst the chaos of siege. Even the spacing between towers was a calculated equation. Positioned at precise intervals along curtain walls, they created overlapping fields of fire, ensuring no blind spot could shield an advancing enemy. Archers could rain down arrows from multiple angles, turning the castle's perimeter into a deadly geometric puzzle. And those sweeping curved walls, far more than aesthetic flair, they dispersed the force of battering rams and catapult stones like armor deflecting a blade. The concentric castles of the Crusades took this further, layering rings of walls so attackers who breached the outer defenses found themselves trapped in a killing zone, exposed to fire from the taller inner towers. But the most cunning math lived in the details. Spiral staircases, twisting clockwise as they rose, forced right-handed invaders to fight with their swords jammed against the central pillar, while defenders descending from above could swing freely. Even the humble arrow slit was a masterpiece of angles, its narrow opening flaring inward to give archers a wide arc of attack while presenting almost no target from afar. These weren't accidents, they were proof scribed in stone, evidence of a time when every chisel strike was a word in a silent debate between force and ingenuity. What's astonishing is how these builders achieved such precision without modern tools. Using ropes knotted at intervals, weighted plumb lines, and wooden compasses, they translated abstract ratios into towering reality. Some scholars believe they even encoded sacred geometry patterns echoing religious symbolism into their designs, blending faith with function. The result: castles that didn't just withstand storms of steel and fire, but seemed to whisper an unshakable truth. That true strength lies not in resisting nature's laws, but in bending them to your will. And just as math shaped these fortresses, physics would dictate their fate, because every wall, every arch was a dance with forces unseen. The true test of a castle's strength wasn't just in its walls, but in how those walls fought back. Medieval engineers didn't just build barriers, they weaponized architecture itself. Take those towering curtain walls, their sloping, battered bases weren't just for show. Angled outward at the bottom, they made tunneling nearly impossible. Any attempt to undermine the foundation would send rubble crashing onto the attackers' heads. And those smooth, curved surfaces, more than just elegant profiles, they turned incoming boulders from trebuchets into glancing blows, sending them skidding harmlessly aside like stones skipping across a pond. Even the mortar between stones played its part, mixed with crushed pottery or animal hair to create a flexible bond that could absorb shock without crumbling. Now step closer to those narrow arrow slits. What looks like a simple vertical gap is actually a precision instrument of war. The inward taper barely wider than a palm on the outside but broadening to shoulder width inside created a funnel of death. An archer could sweep the battlefield with arrows while presenting a target no larger than a grape to enemy fire. Some castles took this further with cross-shaped or circular loopholes, allowing crossbowmen to pivot their aim without changing position. And those murder holes above gatehouses, far more sinister than Hollywood's boiling oil cliché. Dropping quicklime through these openings would blind and suffocate, while heavy stones shattered formations. The real genius was in the timing. Defenders would let attackers pack into the confined gate passage before releasing their payload, turning gravity itself into an executioner. But the most breathtaking physics lived in the soaring keeps. These stone giants relied on load distribution so precise that removing a single cornerstone could risk collapse. Ribbed vaults channeled weight down specific pathways, while flying buttresses later perfected in cathedrals redirected forces outward. In earthquake-prone regions like Cyprus, builders inserted layers of crushed seashells between stones as natural shock absorbers. Even the spiral staircases were feats of structural engineering, their cantilevered steps supported by the central column in a continuous helix that could bear centuries of armored footsteps. And then there were the silent killers, features so subtle most invaders never saw them coming. A slightly raised threshold at doorways tripped charging soldiers. Uneven steps in dark passageways sent stumbles cascading into ambushes. Even the acoustics were weaponized. Curved walls in gate passages amplified the clatter of approaching armor, giving defenders precious seconds to prepare. This wasn't just architecture, it was a three-dimensional chessboard where every line, every angle, every material choice was a move in a game of life and death. Now imagine being an attacker facing this gauntlet of calculated terror. You'd breach the outer wall only to find yourself in a killing courtyard, exposed to fire from all sides. Your siege tower would catch on hidden hooks protruding from the masonry. The drawbridge you stormed could be a trap. Some concealed mechanisms allowed defenders to collapse it suddenly, sending a wave of armored men plunging into spikes below. Every conquest was a mirage, every advance into another layer of peril, because the greatest trick of medieval engineers wasn't building walls that couldn't fall, it was making invaders believe they could. The moment an attacker stepped inside a castle, they entered a world designed to break their spirit as much as their formation. Those winding corridors weren't just narrow, they were psychological traps, forcing invaders to abandon teamwork and face the unknown alone. Picture a warrior clad in heavy armor, squeezing through a passage barely wider than his shoulders, the walls pressing in like a stone vise. Ahead, the path might fork unexpectedly, or worse, end abruptly at a blank wall, leaving him exposed to arrows raining from hidden murder holes above. This wasn't poor planning, it was masterful manipulation. By fragmenting attacking forces into disoriented individuals, castle layouts turned even the mightiest army into a scattered, vulnerable mess. Acoustics played a silent but devastating role. Great halls weren't just spaces, they were amplifiers of dread. The vaulted ceilings caught every clank of armor, every whisper of strategy, and echoed them back as distorted reverberations. An invader's own footsteps could sound like an approaching battalion, seeding doubt about whether the noise came from allies or defenders lying in wait. Some castles took this further, embedding hollow channels in walls to carry voices from distant guard posts, creating the illusion that the very stones were whispering warnings. Even the artwork was a weapon. Gargoyles leering from ceilings weren't mere decoration. Their grotesque faces, twisted in eternal snarls, played on medieval superstitions about demons and curses. A knight already unnerved by darkness might glance up to see stone eyes following his movement, a psychological nudge toward retreat. In some castles, intricate carvings near gateways depicted gruesome scenes of defeated enemies, a visual prophecy meant to sap morale before the first clash. The true cruelty lay in the pacing of these terrors. After navigating a gauntlet of shadows and dead ends, attackers might burst into what seemed like open space, only to find themselves funneled into a killing courtyard, where defenders on surrounding walls could strike from all sides. Some castles added cruel flourishes, like false door handles that burned when touched or staircases with irregular steps to send charging soldiers sprawling. Every element worked in concert to create a single, crushing realization. This wasn't a fortress to be taken, it was a mind game to be survived. And behind these walls, another kind of engineering was at work, one that turned stone into a self-sustaining world. Behind those towering walls, medieval castles hid a secret more precious than gold water. In an era when most cities choked on their own filth, these fortresses functioned as self-contained ecosystems, with engineering that rivaled Roman aqueducts. Deep beneath the great halls, vast cisterns captured every precious drop of rainwater, channeled through gutters carved into the stonework. Some castles stored enough to last a year under siege, not just for drinking, but for putting out fires, washing wounds, even cooling food in specially designed alcoves. The mighty crack des Chevaliers in Syria took this further, with an aqueduct feeding its reservoirs from mountain springs miles away, turning thirst into a weapon no besieging army could counter. Then there were the garderobes, medieval toilets that were anything but primitive. These stone seats protruded from castle walls, their chutes emptying directly into moats or rivers below. Far from just waste disposal, this was biological warfare. A besieging army camped downstream would soon find itself battling dysentery. Some castles added rotating wooden covers to block reverse drafts, while others built dual-chambered systems where lime could be dumped to neutralize odors. At Conwy Castle in Wales, the royal apartments had flushing latrines. Water diverted from nearby streams carried waste out to sea with the tide, a sanitation system centuries ahead of its time. But the real stroke of genius lay in the hidden wells. Dover Castle's shaft plunges 300 feet through solid chalk, its bucket system operable from within fortified chambers. During the Great Siege of 2174, defenders lowered torches to check for poison, a reminder that every convenience doubled as a vulnerability. Meanwhile, ventilation shafts snaking through walls kept storerooms dry, their carefully angled ducts preventing mold on grain sacks that had to last years. Even kitchen placement was strategic, tucked into corner towers with thick stone floors. Their fires posed less risk while the heat rose to warm living quarters above. Climate didn't just influence these designs, it dictated them. In the scorching Levant, castles like Kerak featured wind catchers funneling cool air into vaulted chambers, while Scandinavian fortresses packed earth between double walls as insulation against bitter winters. Welsh castles faced their main windows southward to capture sunlight, whereas desert strongholds used narrow, shaded courtyards to create natural cooling tunnels. This wasn't just adaptation. It was a dialogue between stone and sky, where every archway and arrow slit answered to the turning of seasons. And speaking of climate, few forces tested a castle's mettle like the relentless march of time. The same driving rains that filled cisterns could dissolve poorly chosen mortar, while winter frosts expanded cracks into gaping wounds. So builders mixed their plaster with crushed shells for flexibility, or added horsehair to bind crumbling sandstone. Some Scottish castles used clay-rich mortar that self-healed when damp, a trick learned from watching riverbanks reform after floods. The lesson was clear: to endure, a castle couldn't just resist nature. It had to move with it, bending like a reed in the wind rather than snapping like an oak. What emerges from these details isn't just clever engineering, it's a philosophy. These weren't sterile monuments to war, but living systems that breathed, adapted, even recycled. The rainwater quenching a night's thirst might later put out a fire, then flush waste into fields that grew next season's food. In an age before the word sustainability existed, medieval builders grasped its essence. That survival wasn't about dominating your environment, but dancing with it. And as we'll see next, that dance extended far beyond castle walls, into the very landscapes that shaped them. Castles didn't just stand against armies, they battled the skies themselves. In the biting cold of Scottish highlands, thick walls trapped heat like stone blankets, their tiny windows barely wider than an arrow slit to keep warmth from escaping. Meanwhile, under the blistering Mediterranean sun, castles breathed through arched courtyards and shaded loggias, their open designs funneling sea breezes through vaulted halls like natural air conditioning. Every climate demanded its own solutions. In snow-laden regions like the Alps, roofs pitched steep as mountainsides sent avalanches of powder, sliding harmlessly to the ground before the weight could crush timber supports. Welsh builders turned local slate into scales of armor, layering roofs with the region's metamorphic rock, nature's own waterproof shield that outlasted centuries of storms. But the real mastery lay in how castles danced with the sun. Great halls in England faced southeast, their towering windows angled to drink in weak winter light while avoiding harsh summer glare. In desert fortresses like Syria's cracked Chevaliers, thick walls absorbed heat by day and released it slowly at night, smoothing temperature swings that could crack lesser masonry. Some Scandinavian castles embedded iron rods vertically in walls, When frost threatened to split stones, these metal spines expanded at the same rate as the surrounding rock, holding everything together like hidden stitches. Even the color of mortar was a choice. Light mixtures in southern climates reflected scorching sun, while dark, pitch-infused binders in the north absorbed precious warmth. Adaptation wasn't just about survival, it was deception. A castle in the Loire Valley might mimic local limestone so perfectly that enemies wouldn't spot it until they stumbled into its moat. Venetian engineers blended crushed brick dust into their plaster, creating a rosy hue that hid salt corrosion from Adriatic winds. And in Japan's humid castles, wooden beams were charred until black, a technique called shusugiban that repelled insects and fire alike. These weren't just buildings reacting to weather, they were chameleons, changing their very essence to belong to the land. Perhaps the most astonishing feat was how castles turned natural disasters into allies. Earthquake-prone regions saw walls built with flexible lime mortar that swayed rather than shattered. Floodplains inspired raised basements with grated floors, letting waters pass through without undermining foundations. Even lightning was harnessed. Iron rods atop towers diverted strikes harmlessly into the ground, centuries before modern lightning rods. The lesson was clear. Medieval engineers didn't fight nature's whims, they anticipated them, collaborated with them, sometimes even tricked them. Because the strongest fortress wasn't the one that stood rigid against the storm, but the one that knew when to bend. Now, hidden in the stones themselves was another layer of meaning, symbols carved not for function, but for power and prophecy. Every gargoyle snarling from a medieval castle's heights was more than decoration. It was a multitasking marvel. Those grotesque stone faces served as gutters, channeling rainwater away from walls to prevent erosion, their gaping mouths spouting streams like living fountains. But their true power lay in symbolism. To a superstitious medieval mind, these hybrid creatures, part beast, part human, were spiritual guardians, their terrifying visages meant to scare off evil spirits as much as enemy soldiers. Some historians believe they embodied the chaos outside civilized walls, a reminder that the castle stood as a bulwark against the unknown. Look closer at the walls themselves, and you'll find a language of power carved in stone. Coats of arms weren't just vanity plates for nobility, they were strategic billboards. A lion rampant or fleur-de-lis announced a family's lineage and alliances louder than any herald's trumpet. In border regions, these symbols could deter attacks simply by revealing a connection to a feared dynasty. At Dunstanburgh Castle in England, the twin-towered gatehouse displays the arms of Thomas of Lancaster, a not-so-subtle warning that challenging this fortress meant challenging a man who could rally half the kingdom. Hidden in plain sight were masons' marks, tiny chisel signatures left by the craftsmen who shaped each stone. Far from mere graffiti, these symbols acted as a medieval barcode system. A zigzag or star chiseled into a block identified its creator, allowing lords to trace flaws back to specific workers. Some marks even indicated payment, with complex symbols showing a mason had earned his daily bread. In an age before resumes, these glyphs were a tradesman's portfolio, his skill immortalized in the very bones of the castle. Even a fortress's silhouette spoke volumes. While Hollywood loves to depict castles with 4 towers, the reality was far more nuanced. Edward I's Welsh castles often boasted 8 or more, not for symmetry, but as a mathematical flex. Each additional tower represented wealth and manpower, a visual calculus that could make besiegers reconsider. At Beaumaris Castle, the unfinished second ring of towers wasn't just an architectural feature, it was a psychological gambit, suggesting resources so vast the builders could afford to leave their masterpiece incomplete. The most cunning messages weren't carved but calculated. A labyrinthine approach to the keep forced visitors to pass under strategically placed heraldic carvings, ensuring they absorbed the Lord's pedigree before reaching his presence. In Scotland's Stirling Castle, the Renaissance-era palace block features stone medallions depicting Roman emperors, a bold claim that its Stuart kings were heirs to imperial glory. Every inch of stone whispered subtext: power wasn't just held, it was performed. Now, let's drain the myths surrounding those iconic castle features, moats and drawbridges, because Hollywood has gotten them all wrong. Moats weren't just watery rings around castles, they were precision-engineered death traps designed to exploit every weakness in an attacker's strategy. The ideal width wasn't arbitrary, it was a mathematical equation. Too narrow and siege towers could bridge the gap, too wide and defenders wasted resources maintaining it. The sweet spot, about 30 feet just beyond the reach of the longest scaling ladders, forcing attackers to improvise under a hail of arrows. But water wasn't the only weapon. Some moats stayed deliberately dry, their bottoms studded with chevaux-de-frise, rows of razor-sharp wooden stakes angled to impale charging cavalry. In cracked des Chevaliers, the moat's sloping sides were slicked with algae, turning a simple climb into a lethal slip and slide. Then there were the hidden horrors beneath the surface. Advanced castles like Caerphilly in Wales submerged entire palisades, walls of sharpened logs just below the waterline, to gut anyone attempting to swim across. Others planted caltrops on the moat floor, their iron spikes rusting slowly to ensure any survivor would face infection. Even the water itself could be weaponized. Records from Chateau Gaillard suggest defenders once poisoned their moat with quicklime, turning it into a caustic soup that burned skin and blinded attackers. But the real genius lay in how moats worked with other defenses. A drawbridge wasn't just a plank on chains, it was a counterweighted masterpiece, balanced so a single guard could retract it in seconds. Some, like those at Bodiam Castle, had hidden pivot points allowing the bridge to break mid-span, sending intruders tumbling into the pit below, and if attackers somehow crossed. The gatehouse behind the moat was often a death trap in itself, with murder holes raining destruction from above and portcullises slamming shut to cut off retreat. This wasn't just defense, it was psychological theater. A well-designed moat forced invaders to confront their own mortality before even touching the walls. The glint of spikes beneath the water, the creak of the drawbridge hinges, every detail whispered the same message: turn back or die. And as siege technology advanced, so did these watery fortresses, proving that in the arms race between attacker and defender, even a ditch could become a masterpiece of terror. Now consider how these obstacles evolved alongside the weapons meant to overcome them, because every castle feature was a response to someone, somewhere, inventing a better way to break through. The moment medieval engineers thickened castle walls, attackers answered with trebuchets, catapults capable of hurling 200-pound stones with terrifying precision. These weren't just weapons, they were physics experiments in action, using counterweights to unleash destruction from nearly 1,000 feet away. Walls that once shrugged off arrows now cracked under the impact of boulders the size of millstones. The solution: builders began sandwiching rubble between smooth stone facings, creating walls that absorbed shocks like medieval airbags. A single trebuchet strike might dent the outer layer, but the chaotic jumble of rocks and mortar inside dissipated the force, leaving the structure standing. Round towers emerged as another ingenious adaptation. Square corners, once standard, became fatal flaws when gunpowder-arrived cannonballs could shatter right angles with ease. But a curved surface that sent projectiles skidding off at unpredictable angles, like a stone skipping across a pond. Some towers took this further with star-shaped designs, their zigzagging walls creating dead zones where attackers couldn't aim cannons effectively. Even the stone itself evolved. Builders in vulnerable regions mixed horsehair into mortar for flexibility, or used layered bricks that flexed under bombardment without crumbling. Then came the machicolations, those tooth-like overhangs crowning castle walls. Far from mere decoration, these were murder holes writ large, allowing defenders to rain down everything from boiling sand to quicklime directly onto anyone hugging the base of the wall. The psychological effect was as potent as the physical. Attackers knew that every inch of wall they pressed against could suddenly become a death trap. Yet for all these innovations, one weak point remained stubbornly vulnerable: the gates. No matter how thick the walls, an entrance had to exist, and besiegers knew it. This forced engineers to turn gatehouses into fortresses within fortresses, with multiple portcullises, murder holes, and even flanking towers that let defenders shoot sideways at anyone breaching the door. Some castles, like Caernarfon in Wales, built their gates at sharp angles to the main approach, forcing attackers to expose their unshielded sides. Others added bent entrances, corridors that zigzagged unpredictably, breaking up a charge into disoriented fragments. The true brilliance lay in how these elements worked together. A gatehouse wasn't just a door, it was a gauntlet of calculated terrors, where every step forward meant another layer of defense to overcome. And as we'll soon see, the battle for these entrances sparked some of the most cunning engineering tricks of the Middle Ages, where even the hinges on a door could mean the difference between survival and slaughter. The gatehouse wasn't just a door, it was a meticulously crafted kill box, where medieval engineers turned every inch of space into a lethal equation. Picture an attacking force surging toward what seems like the castle's weakest point, only to find themselves funneled into a narrow passage where the walls themselves conspired against them. The first line of defense, those formidable portcullises, iron gratings weighing as much as a team of oxen, suspended by chains that could be severed in an instant. One tug of a lever and a ton of spiked metal would crash down, slicing an advancing column in half like a guillotine, but the true horror came from above. Murder holes perforated the ceiling, their innocuous appearance belying the carnage they unleashed. Defenders didn't just drop stones, they poured boiling tar that seeped into armor seams, or quicklime that reacted with moisture to blind and blister. Some castles even rigged rotating platforms above these openings, allowing them to pivot between cauldrons of different horrors without exposing themselves to return fire. Then came the illusions. Some gatehouses featured inviting-looking doorways that led not to the courtyard, but to a sealed courtyard, a killing ground where attackers would find themselves trapped like rats in a barrel, exposed to archers on all sides. At Chepstow Castle, the main gate's approach zigzagged unpredictably, forcing siege engines to reposition repeatedly while defenders adjusted their aim. Even the materials were deceptive. Those iron-studded doors weren't just reinforced, their studs were often arranged in patterns that disguised weak points, tricking battering rams into striking hardened sections. And beneath the gate's threshold, hidden pits lined with spikes, covered by boards designed to collapse under the weight of armored men. The real genius lay in sequencing these threats. Portcullis might drop behind attackers first, cutting off retreat before the murder holes activated. Some castles employed choke gates, narrow inner doors that forced invaders to remove their helmets to squeeze through, leaving them vulnerable to arrows from side slits. At Dover Castle, the gate passage slopes upward subtly, slowing attackers' momentum while giving defenders the high ground. Every element was timed like a morbid symphony, each movement triggering the next phase of destruction. Yet the most terrifying feature might have been the silence. Unlike Hollywood's chaotic sieges, real gatehouse defenses relied on eerie precision. No wasted movements, no panicked shouts, just the mechanical clank of a portcullis ceiling, the whisper of arrows finding gaps in visors, the hiss of boiling liquid finding flesh. This wasn't battle, it was industrial-scale extermination, engineered to break not just bodies but morale. Because the gatehouse's ultimate weapon wasn't its spikes or traps, it was the dawning realization that every step forward had been anticipated, every assault countered before it began. And as we'll see next, some castles took this mind games further, using illusions so convincing they could make entire armies question their own eyes. The moment sunlight hit a medieval castle's walls, the mind games began. Builders didn't just rely on brute strength, they weaponized perception itself. Take those towering keeps with rows of tiny upper windows. From a distance, the forced perspective made walls appear twice as high as they really were, tricking attackers into overestimating the climb. Some castles went further, positioning reflective pools at precise angles to double their silhouette in still water, a shimmering mirage of invincibility that could make entire armies hesitate. Then there were the phantom defenders. Arrow slits spaced at regular intervals might seem like proof of a garrisoned army until you realized half were shallow carvings, painted shadows mimicking the real thing. At Beaumaris Castle in Wales, builders staggered genuine and fake loopholes so attackers could never guess which slots hid actual archers. Even the crenellations played tricks. Some battlements had alternating tall and short merlons, creating jagged silhouettes that confused distance perception in the chaos of battle. The most brilliant illusions weren't seen but felt. Approaching attackers would spot murder holes lining a gatehouse ceiling only to later discover some were just carved indentations, their darkness hiding empty stone. This forced besiegers to waste energy shielding against threats that didn't exist, their paranoia doing the defenders' work for them. Some castles added false weak spots, sections of wall deliberately built with uneven masonry to bait sappers into tunneling there, only to find hidden countermines waiting beneath. Acoustics joined the deception. Narrow, whispering galleries in curtain walls could carry a sentry's cough across the length of the fortress, making a handful of guards sound like a crowded garrison. At Château de Coucy in France, the hollow drum towers amplified footsteps into thunderous echoes, convincing nighttime raiders they faced impossible numbers. Now imagine being a medieval commander surveying such a fortress. Every glance revealed new contradictions. Walls that seemed to lean ominously forward actually sloped to deflect projectiles. Gateways that appeared invitingly unguarded until you noticed the murder holes disguised as drainage channels. Even entire towers that vanished when viewed from certain angles thanks to clever shadow play. These weren't just buildings, they were labyrinths of doubt where every assumption could be a death trap. And just when attackers thought they'd decoded the illusions, the real spies would emerge because castles didn't just trick the eyes, they recruited invisible ears. Hidden passages snaked through walls wide enough for a single man, allowing defenders to slip behind enemy lines undetected. At Conisbrough Castle, a secret stairway spiraled inside the thickness of the keep's walls, emerging behind what looked like solid masonry. Some castles built sally ports, camouflaged doors that could disgorge a strike force into the enemy's rear, then vanish back into the stone like ghosts. The true masters of this shadow war were the castle's servants, often overlooked, but perfectly positioned to gather intelligence. Kitchen staff could count ration deliveries to estimate siege army sizes. Stable boys noted which nobles' horses wore battle barding instead of travel gear. Even the castle dogs played their part, trained to bark at unfamiliar accents, their cacophony masking whispered warnings between defenders. This was psychological warfare at its most sophisticated, where every brick lied and every shadow listened. Now, let's pull back the curtain on the greatest trick of all: how castles transformed from military machines into symbols of power that outlasted the very wars they were built to fight. Beneath the flickering torchlight of medieval castles lay secrets within secrets, networks of hidden passages so carefully engineered. They turned stone walls into whispering allies for those who knew their routes. These weren't just escape tunnels, they were the nervous system of the fortress, pulsing with intelligence. Take the solar room's private chambers high in the keep, where lords could observe unsuspecting guests through cleverly disguised peepholes. At Goodrich Castle in England, one such opening frames the high table in the Great Hall perfectly, its sightline concealed within carved foliage on a wall beam. A lord could watch his vassals toast his health while secretly noting who drank with a little too much enthusiasm, or who whispered to a rival when they thought no one was looking. Then there were the listening tubes, narrow shafts built into walls that funneled sound like primitive microphones. In the round towers of Conway Castle, conversations in the lower chambers traveled upward through hollow pillars, allowing spies in adjacent rooms to eavesdrop on prisoners or suspicious guests. Some castles took this further with whispering galleries, curved corridors where a sentry's murmur near one arch could be heard clearly 30 feet away near another. These weren't architectural accidents, they were carefully calibrated instruments of surveillance, turning the very stones into spies. The most daring designs hid entire spy networks in plain sight. Servant staircases doubled as observation posts, their zigzagging paths offering glimpses into guest quarters through concealed gaps. At Raglan Castle, a mural stair, hidden within the thickness of a wall, let messengers move undetected between the lord's private apartments and the garrison below. Even chapel walls weren't sacred. Some featured discreet openings where confessional conversations could be overheard by scribes in adjacent chambers. But the crown jewel of castle espionage was the postern gate, a secret exit often accessible only through a labyrinth of cellars or garderobe chutes. These weren't just escape routes, they were lifelines during sieges, allowing scouts to slip past enemy lines under cover of darkness. Dover Castle's postern tunnel, carved through solid chalk, emerges nearly a mile from the fortress, a hidden highway for spies and resupply caravans alike. What emerges from these covert corridors is a startling truth. Medieval castles weren't just fortresses of stone, but fortresses of information. Every whispered plot, every scout's report, every intercepted message flowed through these hidden veins, proving that knowledge wasn't just power, it was the difference between holding a throne or losing a head. And as we'll see next, the same walls that guarded secrets also hoarded treasures of a different kind. Behind those towering battlements, castles weren't just fortresses, they were bustling economic hubs, their very designs engineered to turn stone into profit. Take those cavernous storerooms beneath the great halls. While their thick walls shielded grain from raiders, they also functioned as medieval banks, where a lord's wealth was measured in barrels of salted meat and sacks of wool. At Chepstow Castle, the Undercroft's vaulted ceilings kept goods dry for years, allowing the lord to control local prices by releasing stores during shortages. Nearby, blacksmiths hammered out plowshares by day and arrowheads by night, their forges built into curtain walls so the same bellows that stoked commerce could fuel war. Strategic placement turned geography into gold. Riverside castles like Rochester in England didn't just draw water, they drew wealth, their towering keeps looming over trade routes where merchants had no choice but to pay tolls. Records from the 14th century show Dover Castle's dock fees alone funded an entire garrison for a year. Some lords got creative. At Caernarfon Castle, the wall walks doubled as customs checkpoints, where guards could inspect goods on barges below while archers stood ready to enforce compliance. The real economic magic happened in those sunlit inner courtyards. What looks like empty space to modern eyes was actually a medieval shopping mall during peacetime. Fairs at castles like Warwick drew merchants from across Europe, their stalls radiating from the central well-like spokes on a wheel, a design that ensured thirsty crowds passed every vendor. The castle's walls provided security no village marketplace could match, allowing transactions to flourish without fear of bandits. Even the architecture encouraged spending. Covered arcades along the inner walls gave shade in summer and shelter in winter, keeping customers comfortable and spending longer. But this economic engine had a foul underbelly. The same walls that protected riches also trapped filth, turning castles into petri dishes of medieval public health. Garderobes might have been ingenious for waste disposal, but during sieges when no one could empty them, their contents backed up into courtyards. At the siege of Chateau-Gaillard in 1204, defenders reportedly threw dead horses into their own well rather than let attackers poison it, contaminating their water supply for weeks. The castle's brilliant ventilation shafts, so effective at dispersing kitchen smoke, became conduits for disease when overcrowded with refugees. The solution: a hidden network of sanitation that rivaled the Romans. Some castles featured tiered drainage channels carved into their foundations, using rainwater to flush waste into moats, transforming a defensive feature into a primitive sewer system. At Conwy Castle, clay pipes embedded in the walls carried runoff from roofs straight to the river, while underground conduits at Kenilworth funneled kitchen scraps beyond the walls to waiting swine. The smartest designs placed latrines on exterior walls where waste could drop directly into flowing water, though this led to another problem. Besiegers quickly learned to watch for these telltale stains, to pinpoint weak spots in the masonry. What emerges is a paradox. Castles were both the pinnacle of medieval innovation and breeding grounds for squalor, their very strengths creating vulnerabilities. The same thick walls that safeguarded trade goods also trapped miasmas. The crowded courtyards that buzzed with commerce became death traps when plague struck. Yet even this duality served a purpose by concentrating wealth and people. Castles forced societies to confront problems of scale that villages could ignore, accelerating solutions from quarantine protocols to rudimentary plumbing. In the end, these stone giants weren't just shelters for the elite. They were crucibles where the modern world's messy relationship between profit and public health first took shape. For all their brilliance, medieval castles weren't perfect, and sometimes their greatest strengths became their most dangerous flaws. Take ventilation. Those thick walls that deflected arrows also trapped stagnant air inside, turning great halls into breeding grounds for respiratory diseases. In the depths of winter, when tapestries were drawn tight against the cold, the damp breath of hundreds crammed together created a mist of contagion. Records from the Tower of London describe guards suffering from castle cough, a persistent ailment caused by mold spores thriving in perpetually damp stone. Even the garderobes, ingenious for waste disposal, backfired when wind direction shifted, piping foul odors back into living quarters through those same clever ventilation shafts. Then there were the moats, those shimmering rings of protection that could transform into toxic swamps by midsummer. Stagnant water bred mosquitoes by the thousands, turning picturesque fortresses like Bodiam Castle into malaria hotspots during warmer months. Some lords tried lining moats with quicklime to purify the water, only to discover it killed the fish they relied on for Lenten meals. In drought-prone regions like southern France, dried-up moats became fire hazards, their sun-baked mud cracking into fissures that allowed besiegers to tunnel beneath the walls undetected. Winter exposed another vulnerability. Stone is a merciless conductor of cold. However thick the walls, frost seeped through like invisible invaders, icing the insides of bedchambers and turning castle floors into skating rinks. At Edinburgh Castle, servants reportedly woke to find wine frozen solid in its cups. Lords draped walls with woolen hangings not just for show. Those tapestries were medieval insulation, battling chill drafts that no fireplace could fully conquer. The irony, those towering fireplaces designed to heat great halls often sucked warm air up and out through chimneys, leaving occupants shivering while the ceilings glowed with wasted heat. Sieges magnified every weakness. A castle built for a garrison of 50 might swell with 500 refugees during an attack, its latrines overflowing and fresh water reserves draining within days. At the Siege of Rochester in 1215, defenders resorted to drinking their horses' blood once the well ran dry. Overcrowding turned courtyards into petri dishes. Dysentery could kill more soldiers than enemy arrows. Even victory came at a cost after prolonged sieges. Survivors often found their own fortress uninhabitable, its stores spoiled and its walls reeking of death. These flaws reveal a sobering truth. Castles weren't invincible strongholds, but carefully balanced systems where every advantage carried hidden trade-offs. A moat that stopped armies also bred disease. Walls that withstood boulders trapped deadly humidity. Gatehouses that funneled enemies also bottlenecked fresh air. Yet perhaps the greatest lesson lies in how builders adapted. When Crusaders encountered malaria in the Levant, they redesigned castles with elevated sleeping quarters to catch desert breezes. Scottish lords packed earth between double walls to insulate against northern winds. Each failure sparked innovation, proof that medieval engineering wasn't about achieving perfection, but about relentlessly solving problems as they arose. Now, let's widen our view beyond Europe, because while knights were perfecting stone fortresses halfway across the world, other cultures were crafting defenses that turned geography into poetry. From the cloud-piercing walls of Japan's mountaintop citadels to the sun-baked ramparts of Moroccan Casbahs, global fortifications shared the same goal but took dramatically different paths to get there. While European castles were reaching their zenith across the world, master builders faced the same challenges and often arrived at eerily similar solutions. Take Japan's soaring Tenshu towers. Their massive stone bases anchored them against typhoons, while the lighter wooden upper stories swayed like bamboo during earthquakes, flexing rather than fracturing. At Heimji Castle, the so-called White Heron, walls curve inward as they rise, not just for beauty. This subtle tapering shifted the center of gravity downward, making the structure uncannily stable even as the ground trembled. Sound familiar? It's the same principle behind Europe's battered walls, proving that continents apart, engineers grasped the physics of deflection. India's Mehrangarh Fort tells another tale of convergent genius. Its 30-foot thick walls weren't solid. They were honeycombed with hidden chambers and air pockets, a design that dissipated cannon blasts like a sponge soaking up water. Just as Crusader castles used rubble cores between stone facings, these labyrinthine interiors turned what should have been catastrophic impacts into muffled thuds. Even the fort's red sandstone changed color when wet, acting as a natural moisture alarm, a trick Welsh builders replicated by embedding seashells in their mortar. The real shock comes when you spot the shared solutions no one taught each other. Moroccan Casbahs and Scottish tower houses both used narrow, twisting staircases to bottleneck attackers, though their builders never met. Ottoman castles in Albania and Norman keeps in Ireland independently angled their arrow slits to cover identical blind spots. From the cloud-scraping watchtowers of China's Great Wall to the cliff-carved strongholds of Ethiopia's Amhara region, the same patterns emerge: curved walls to deflect projectiles, tiered defenses to create kill zones, even matching systems for rainwater harvesting. What explains this uncanny alignment? Necessity, not networking. When survival hangs in the balance, physics dictates the solutions. A cannonball doesn't care about culture. It obeys the same laws whether fired by French knights or Mughal warlords. And so, across deserts and jungles, through languages and centuries, the best minds arrived at the same conclusions because the problems and the immutable rules of mass, velocity, and material science remained unchanged. This global perspective reveals castles not as European inventions, but as human ones. They're monuments to our universal instinct to protect what matters, shaped by the unyielding realities of gravity and geometry. Whether built from Andean granite or Baltic timber, whether manned by samurai or Teutonic knights, these structures whisper the same truth, that when faced with existential threats, humanity's brilliance transcends borders. Now, let's turn from the stones to the minds that shaped them, the unsung engineering visionaries who turned desperation into enduring genius. Behind every towering castle wall stood the true architects of medieval might, not the lords who commissioned them, but the master masons who turned raw stone into mathematical marvels. These craftsmen operated in secretive guilds, guarding techniques like precious treasures. Take the English bond, a seemingly simple pattern where layers of stone alternated between long stretchers and short headers. This interlocking design distributed weight so perfectly that walls built this way 800 years ago still stand straight today, their mortar-less joints tighter than modern concrete. Apprenticeship was a grueling rite of passage. Young masons spent years learning to carve stones with such precision that a knife blade couldn't slip between them. At Canterbury Cathedral, records show apprentices practiced on soft limestone before graduating to harder varieties, their chisels dancing to create dovetail joints that locked together like puzzle pieces. The true masters could shape a block blindfolded, reading the stone's grain through their fingertip skills passed down through generations in cryptic guild rituals. Some of their innovations border on alchemy. At Conwy Castle, masons mixed ox blood into mortar to create a frost-resistant binder that outlasted centuries of Welsh winters. Others embedded charred timber into foundations, an early form of rot-proofing still used in Japanese castles. But their greatest legacy might be the vaulted ceilings that inspired Gothic cathedrals. By transferring weight along ribbed arches, these stone weavers created spans so vast they seemed to defy gravity, proving that medieval engineering wasn't just about brute strength, it was about elegance hidden in plain sight. These unsung geniuses left their signatures in stone literally. Look closely at castle walls and you'll find tiny chisel marks, masons' brands identifying who carved each block. At Beaumaris Castle, these symbols form a secret ledger, a zigzag for the apprentice, a five-pointed star for the master who checked his work. Their knowledge became so prized that captured masons were often spared during sieges. Enemy lords would offer them double wages to defect. Today, their influence echoes in surprising places. Those interlocking stone patterns, modern earthquake-proof buildings use similar load distribution. The precise mortar mixes developed for castles now inform heritage restoration. Even the guild system itself lives on in trade unions and apprenticeship programs. These medieval STEM pioneers didn't just build castles, they laid the groundwork for centuries of architectural innovation, proving that the strongest foundations aren't made of stone, but of knowledge carefully passed from one generation to the next. And when we trace the lineage from those ancient walls to today's cityscapes, the connections grow even clearer because castles didn't just dominate medieval skylines, they shaped the very blueprint of modern architecture. Those towering medieval fortresses didn't just vanish into history, they evolved, their DNA woven into the structures we rely on today. Take the modern sports stadium where thousands pour through exits in minutes. Those efficient pathways, they're direct descendants of castle vomitoria, the cleverly named passageways Roman amphitheaters borrowed from medieval designs, allowing defenders to flood courtyards with soldiers or empty grand halls in moments. Architects now use the same principle to prevent deadly crushes, proving 13th century crowd control still saves lives 800 years later. Up in the clouds, skyscrapers whisper secrets learned from castle towers. The tapered silhouette of Dubai's Burj Khalifa isn't just for aesthetics, it's a wind-defying marvel, mirroring how round castle towers disperse the force of storms and siege engines. Engineers today call it aerodynamic stepping, but medieval masons knew it simply as survival. Even earthquake-resistant buildings owe a debt to those rubble-filled castle walls. Modern, sheer walls in high rises work just like the flexible cores of Norman keeps, absorbing shocks instead of resisting them. Closer to home, your front door might harbor medieval secrets. That peephole, a miniature arrow slit, smart doorbells with angled cameras. They're the digital grandchildren of murder holes, giving homeowners the same advantage castle defenders had seeing threats without being seen. Even neighborhood security gates borrow from castle playbooks, using staggered entrances to force visitors into controlled checkpoints, just like attackers funneled into deadly gatehouse kill zones. But perhaps the most surprising legacy lies underground. Modern subway tunnels mirror castle siege mines, their reinforced tubes pushing through unstable earth. The channel tunnels' safety alcoves, they're direct replicas of castle wall passages where defenders waited to ambush sappers. And when engineers design blast-resistant buildings today, they study how castle walls dispersed the impact of trebuchet stones, turning ancient violence into contemporary safety. This isn't just coincidence, it's the genius of necessity. Medieval builders faced problems we still grapple with: how to move crowds safely, how to make structures weather disasters, how to deter intruders without constant vigilance. Their solutions, forged in desperation, became timeless tools. The next time you walk through a revolving door, notice how its design forces one-person entry, a trick borrowed from castle corridors that broke charging armies into vulnerable individuals. Or glance at a bank's layered security, echoing the concentric walls of Crusader castles. Everywhere you look, the past whispers through the present, proving that true innovation never ages, it just finds new skins. Now let's shatter the illusions Hollywood has plastered over these stone marvels, starting with the biggest myth of all. Hollywood has painted castles with a broad brush of fantasy, but the reality is far more fascinating and often surprising. Take those infamous dungeons, dark pits where movies love to toss unlucky prisoners. In truth, most medieval castles didn't even have dedicated dungeons. High-status captives were typically held in the upper floors of towers where they could be monitored closely, not in some dank basement, the Tower of London's so-called dungeons. Many were actually storerooms repurposed by later storytellers, and forget the cliché of skeletons chained to walls. Prisoners often lived in relative comfort, with some even hosting visitors or conducting business while under guard. Then there's the myth of the Grand Banquet Hall, a staple of every medieval film. While some later castles boasted impressive halls, early ones were far more modest. Picture a smoky, low-ceilinged space where the lord's family, servants, and even livestock might share warmth in winter, those roaring feasts with overflowing platters. Exaggerated, fresh meat was a luxury, preserved foods were often rancid, and spices were so valuable they were locked away like treasure. Even the famed high table wasn't about grandeur. It was practical, placing the Lord close to the only reliable heat source, the central fireplace. As for moats, forget the idea of crocodiles lurking in the depths. Most were simple dry ditches filled with sharpened stakes, and water-filled versions were more likely to harbor disease than exotic predators. The few historical accounts of moat animals describe swans or dogs guard creatures that didn't require tropical climates. The real purpose of moats wasn't drama but delay. They forced attackers to slow down, making them easy targets for archers. These myths aren't just harmless fun, they obscure the true genius of castle design. By stripping away the Hollywood gloss, we uncover something far more remarkable: pragmatic solutions to brutal challenges. Which brings us to the most scientifically advanced castle ever conceived, a fortress so ahead of its time, it redefined the limits of medieval engineering. Perched on a windswept ridge in modern-day Syria, Crac des Chevaliers wasn't just a castle, it was a medieval supercomputer, its every stone calculating survival. Built by the Knights Hospitaller in the 12th century, this fortress became the gold standard of military engineering, blending brute strength with breathtaking subtlety. Its concentric walls, a nested puzzle of defenses, forced attackers to conquer not one barrier but 5, each higher than the last. Imagine being an invading soldier. You'd breach the outer wall only to find yourself trapped in a killing zone, exposed to arrows from all sides, your progress funneled into ever narrower channels where death waited around every curve. The genius wasn't just in the walls but in the spaces between them. Those sloping glacis, gentle stone ramps angling up from the base, weren't just aesthetic. They turned incoming boulders into harmless ricochets, their smooth surfaces sending projectiles skidding skyward like stones skipping across a pond. Even the moat was a masterclass in sustainability. Fed by hidden aqueducts tapping mountain springs, it never ran dry, its waters replenished by nature itself. And when attackers tried to poison it, the castle's ingenious filtration system, layers of gravel and charcoal, rendered their efforts useless. Step inside, and the innovations grew even more astonishing. Ventilation shafts carved through the limestone created natural airflow, keeping storerooms cool and dry. Grain stored here could last a decade, outlasting sieges that starved lesser fortresses. The chapel's acoustics amplified whispered prayers into booming proclamations, while its vaulted ceilings dispersed weight so perfectly that 8 centuries of earthquakes couldn't crack them. Even the latrines were engineering marvels, their chutes angled to harness wind patterns, carrying waste away without a trace of odor. Historians call Crac des Chevaliers the apex of castle science because it didn't just resist destruction, it anticipated it. Every arch, every stair, every slit in the stone was a preemptive answer to threats not yet invented. When gunpowder arrived centuries later, analysts found its walls could have withstood early cannons, proof that these builders weren't just solving problems but foreseeing them. So could we build a castle today? Technically, yes, but we'd struggle to match their ingenuity without modern machinery. Medieval engineers lacked computers, but they had something we've largely lost: the ability to think in 4 dimensions, weaving time itself into their design. They chose stones not just for today's strength, but for how they'd weather in 100 years. They positioned towers not just for views, but for the shadows they'd cast at summer solstice, when attackers were most likely to strike. Their brilliance wasn't in overcoming limits, but in turning those limits into advantages. The real lesson of Crac des Chevaliers isn't about stone, it's about mindset. In an age before blueprints, these builders created structures so perfect that restorers today can't slide a credit card between their joints. They remind us that true innovation isn't about having the best tools, but about seeing the world differently, where every obstacle is a design opportunity, and every weakness, if studied closely enough, becomes a hidden strength. Imagine constructing a castle today with all our modern technology, carbon fiber-reinforced walls that laugh off cannon fire, drone swarms patrolling the battlements, even motion sensors detecting invaders before they breach the outer gate. On paper, we could engineer a fortress more impenetrable than anything the Middle Ages dreamed of, yet something vital would be missing: the soul of the stone. Modern composites don't weather like limestone, their surfaces never softening into that golden patina that whispers of centuries past. Our precision-cut alloys lack the subtle irregularities of hand-chiseled blocks, each imperfection telling the story of the mason who shaped it. We could build stronger, yes, but could we ever recreate the haunting elegance of a crumbling Norman keep, where every crack and moss-stained crevice hums with history? The real magic of medieval castles wasn't just their strength, it was their symbiosis with time. Those builders worked with an intimate understanding of how materials would age, choosing stones that grew more beautiful with erosion rather than resisting it. The honey-colored walls of Carcassonne didn't start that way. Their warmth emerged over 800 summers of sunlight baking the sandstone. Compare that to modern concrete, which stains and crumbles in ways no architect intends. There's a lesson here: durability isn't just about resisting decay, but embracing it gracefully. Then consider the human element. A medieval castle wasn't designed on a computer screen. It evolved through trial and error, each siege revealing flaws that inspired new innovations. Today's engineers might simulate 1,000 attacks digitally, but could they replicate the instinctive genius of masons who adjusted plans mid-construction based on the quirks of local bedrock? At Beaumaris Castle in Wales, the walls subtly thicken near the shoreline where storms hit, hardest a tweak born not from calculations, but from a builder's gut feeling about the sea's fury. Perhaps the most irreplaceable ingredient was time itself. Castles weren't rushed, they matured like fine wine. The soaring walls of Burg Eltz in Germany took 5 generations to complete, each era leaving its mark in the stone. Modern construction thrives on speed. A skyscraper rises in months, but castles remind us that some things can't be hurried. Their strength came not just from mortar, but from the slow accumulation of wisdom, layer upon layer, like the strata of the earth. This isn't just nostalgia, it's a warning. In our race to innovate, we risk forgetting how to build for the ages. The Pantheon still stands after 2 millennia because Roman engineers understood concrete's secrets better than we do today. Likewise, medieval castles hold lessons about sustainability we've only begun to rediscover. Passive cooling systems, local materials, structures that adapt rather than dominate their environment. The next time you marvel at a glass and steel tower, ask yourself, will its ruins inspire awe 800 years from now? Now, let's shift our gaze from stone to symbolism, because castles weren't just fortresses. They were the birthplaces of nations, their silhouettes etched into the very identity of the lands they guarded. From the rugged keeps of Scotland to the sun-baked citadels of Spain, these stones became the stage upon which kingdoms rose and fell. France's soaring chateaux weren't just homes for kings, they were stone manifestos, their delicate spires and symmetrical gardens proclaiming a nation's belief in divine order and centralized power. Versailles' Hall of Mirrors didn't just reflect candlelight, it reflected an entire philosophy where every angle whispered that humanity could impose perfection on nature. Meanwhile, Germany's brooding bergs clung to mountain crags like eagles' nests, their uneven silhouettes celebrating regional lords who bowed to no emperor. Each turret and tower told a story. In France, geometry as governance. In Germany, rugged individualism carved in granite. The spiritual dimension of castle design runs deeper than aesthetics. Consider the sacred geometry woven into Welsh castles like Harlech, where circular towers mirrored Celtic notions of eternity. No beginning, no end, just unbroken strength. Crusader castles in the Levant took this further, aligning their chapels' altars to catch the dawn light on saints' feast days, turning sunlight into sacrament. Even the humble arrow slit carried symbolism. Its narrow vertical form echoed Gothic cathedral windows, a reminder that defense and devotion shared the same architectural language. Some castles became literal vessels for the divine. Mont Saint Michel's Abbey Fortress ascends in 3 tiers: military might at the base, merchant halls in the middle, the ethereal chapel crowning the summit. Pilgrims climbing its ramparts weren't just approaching a shrine, they were reenacting the soul's journey from earthly struggle to heavenly grace. Similarly, Japan's Heimji Castle's white plaster walls weren't just fireproof, they evoked the purity of Buddhist enlightenment, transforming a war machine into a meditation on transcendence. The most profound spiritual touches were often the subtlest. At Scotland's Dunnottar Castle, a tiny chapel window frames the exact spot where the North Sea meets the sky, a daily reminder that even the mightiest fortress was dwarfed by creation. Cracked des Chevaliers hid crosses in its masonry patterns, visible only at certain sun angles, as if the stones themselves whispered psalms. These weren't random flourishes, they were carefully coded messages about power, mortality, and humanity's place between earth and heaven. What emerges is a startling truth. Castles were the medieval world's cathedrals of applied philosophy. Every arch confessed a belief about man's relationship to the divine, every wall thickness a wager on where true security lay. To walk their corridors wasn't just to tour a fortress, it was to step inside the minds of people who saw no divide between the practical and the sacred, who believed a well-angled buttress could be both military strategy and prayer. Their stones still speak to anyone willing to listen, not just of kings and conquests, but of the eternal human yearning to build bridges between the earthly and the eternal. The same hands that carved murder holes and arrow slits also traced sacred geometry into castle stones, hidden patterns that turned fortresses into celestial compasses. At the heart of Mont Saint Michel, the abbey's cloister aligns so precisely with the summer solstice sunrise that the first golden rays illuminate the high altar like a divine spotlight. This wasn't coincidence, it was calculus in stone, blending faith with astronomy. Even secular castles whispered spirituality. Spiral staircases in Welsh strongholds like Conwy twist upward to the right, mirroring the path of pilgrims circling holy sites. Some scholars argue these designs weren't just symbolic, they were believed to channel celestial protection, as if the stars themselves guarded the walls. Chapels weren't afterthoughts but strategic anchors. In Cracked des Chevaliers, the chapel sits at the geometric center, its vaulted ceiling ribs forming a cross visible only from certain angles, a hidden benediction for defenders. Meanwhile, Scotland's Dunnottar Castle positions its chapel on the eastern cliff, so morning light spills through the window at the exact hour monks would chant matins. The effect was psychological warfare as much as worship. Besiegers watching from afar would see the fortress bathed in dawn light, its windows blazing like celestial fire. Then there are the mysteries modern archaeologists still debate. At Chateau de Chambord, the double helix staircase, a marvel attributed to Leonardo da Vinci's influence, spirals in a perfect Fibonacci sequence, the same ratio found in sunflower seeds and galaxy arms. Was this Renaissance artistry or intentional sacred math? And why do so many castle wells plunge exactly 108 feet deep, a number sacred in Buddhism, Hinduism, and Christianity alike? Whether by design or uncanny intuition, medieval builders seemed to weave the cosmos into their craft. This fusion of faith and function reveals a worldview where physics and divinity weren't opposites but partners. A buttress wasn't just structural, its upward thrust echoed Gothic arches reaching for heaven. Arrow slits didn't just kill, their narrow vertical forms mirrored the thin spaces between earthly and divine realms in medieval mysticism. Even the castle's footprint often followed the cross-shaped crux gemata, with towers marking the cardinal directions like living compasses. The message was clear: true security came not just from thick walls, but from harmony with forces beyond human scale. Now, as lasers scan these stones with pixel-perfect precision, we're uncovering layers even the builders might have forgotten. LiDAR imaging at Beaumaris Castle revealed hidden alignments with constellations only visible during specific saints' feasts. Spectral analysis of mortar in Spain's Alhambra detected traces of rose oil and myrrh sacred scents mixed into the very fabric of the walls. Each discovery peels back another page of this lost manuscript in stone, where every chisel mark was a prayer and every tower a hymn to equilibrium between earth and sky. The future of castle studies lies in this intersection of hard science and intangible belief. Archaeoastronomers now map how solstice light interacts with loopholes, while material scientists analyze how medieval lime mortar self-heals like living tissue. Teams in Germany are using AI to decode masons' marks, searching for patterns that might reveal lost guild secrets. And in a twist of poetic justice, drones, the descendants of siege engines, now capture aerial surveys that show how castle placements mirror ancient ley lines. What emerges isn't just a revision of history, but a revelation that the greatest strength of these fortresses may have been the very thing we've overlooked: their silent dialogue with the divine. The stones of medieval castles are finally giving up their secrets, not to chisels and brushes, but to humming supercomputers and laser beams dancing across ancient walls. Cutting-edge tools like LiDAR light detection and ranging are peeling back centuries of overgrowth and soil to reveal ghostly outlines of long-lost siege tunnels beneath famous fortresses. At Dover Castle, these scans uncovered a network of escape routes branching like subterranean veins, some leading all the way to nearby cliffs where ships could spirit away defenders under cover of darkness. Meanwhile, in Spain's Alhambra, ground-penetrating radar detected hidden chambers behind ornate walls, their contents still unknown but whispering of forgotten treasures or perhaps prisoners who never saw daylight again. The real revolution lies in the microscopic world. Advanced spectrometry now deciphers the chemical fingerprints in medieval mortar like culinary recipes, traces of crushed seashells from Normandy beaches, volcanic ash shipped from Italian quarries, even goat hair imported from North Africa. These ingredients form a material passport, tracing the movements of mason guilds across continents. At Carcassonne, AI analysis of these mixtures revealed something startling. Entire sections of the famed walls were rebuilt not after battles, but earthquakes, forcing historians to rewrite the timeline of medieval seismic activity in southern France. Perhaps the most astonishing breakthroughs come from digital reconstruction. Using drone photogrammetry and historical records, researchers at the University of Exeter virtually rebuilt the vanished wooden framework of Tintagel Castle's Great Hall, revealing how its intricate carpentry mirrored Viking shipbuilding techniques. Elsewhere, thermal imaging cameras detect subtle temperature variations in stone, exposing hidden arrow loops that were plastered over during peacetime, then hastily reopened when threats loomed. But the true gift of this technology isn't just uncovering facts, it's restoring humanity to these silent sentinels. At Kenilworth Castle, analysis of wear patterns on spiral staircases revealed which steps were most trodden, allowing archaeologists to reconstruct the daily routes of servants versus nobility. In Scotland, AI-enhanced scans of Dunnotter's fire-damaged stones identified soot patterns matching 16th century candle holders, letting us see the fortress not as a ruin, but as it looked flickering in candlelight during a noble's midnight vigil. What emerges from this high-tech detective work is a profound truth. Medieval builders were even smarter than we imagined. Their mortar recipes anticipated modern concrete's self-healing properties. Their vaulted ceilings prefigured earthquake-resistant skyscrapers. Even their decorative carvings served acoustic purposes, bouncing warnings off curved surfaces like medieval sonar. As lasers trace every chisel mark and algorithms decode mason's symbols, we're not just studying history, we're rediscovering a lost school of engineering genius. The future promises even more revelations. Quantum sensors may soon detect faint magnetic disturbances from centuries-old blacksmith forges. DNA analysis of mortar could reveal the diets of the workers who mixed it. And neural networks are beginning to predict where undiscovered chambers likely hide based on subtle architectural patterns. Each breakthrough peels back another layer, proving these castles weren't just fortresses, they were living textbooks, their stones inked with lessons about resilience, innovation, and the timeless art of turning weakness into strength. Standing at the intersection of past and future, we're learning that every crack in these walls holds a story, every faded fresco a lost chapter of human ingenuity. The greatest siege these castles ever faced isn't from armies or time, it's from our own curiosity, armed with tools those medieval masters could never have imagined. And just like the defenders of old, the stones are yielding their secrets slowly, teaching us that true understanding, like true strength, comes layer by patient layer. The towering walls of medieval castles stand not just as monuments to the past, but as masterclasses in human ingenuity, lessons carved in stone that still speak to us across the centuries. What makes these structures truly timeless isn't their grandeur, but the universal truths they embody. That resilience isn't about brute strength, but about adaptation. Consider how castle builders turned every limitation into an advantage. When they lacked modern cranes, they devised pulley systems powered by human treadmills. When they faced new siege weapons, they reinvented wall designs rather than simply making them thicker. Their genius lay in seeing constraints not as obstacles, but as invitations to innovate. There's profound wisdom in how these engineers worked with nature rather than against it. They didn't flatten hills to build. They sculpted fortresses into the landscape, using cliffs as natural shields and rivers as moats. Modern architects now call this biomimicry, but medieval builders understood it intuitively. The land itself was their co-designer. Today's green buildings with living walls and passive cooling systems. Their rediscovering principles castles perfected centuries ago. That true sustainability means listening to the environment and responding creatively. Perhaps the most striking lesson is how castles balanced form and function. Those soaring towers weren't just defensive tools, they were psychological chess moves, their very silhouettes projecting power and permanence. In our era of cookie-cutter construction, we've lost some of that holistic vision, but the castles remind us that great design serves multiple purposes. A wall protects, but it can also inspire. A gateway controls access, but it can also awe. The best solutions then and now address both practical needs and the human spirit. These stone sentinels also teach us about the power of incremental progress. No single architect invented the perfect castle. Each generation built upon the failures and triumphs of the last. The rounded towers of the Crusader castles evolved from the square towers that crumbled under cannon fire. The concentric walls of Edward I's Welsh fortresses refined earlier designs through painful trial and error. Innovation wasn't about sudden leaps, but about steady, collective learning, a reminder that our own breakthroughs often stand on centuries of quiet experimentation. Most importantly, castles embody a paradox. They were built for war, yet their greatest legacy is peace. The very walls meant to repel invaders became the foundations for thriving towns, their protective embrace allowing commerce and culture to flourish. In an age of division, that's a potent metaphor that true security isn't about isolation, but about creating conditions where community can grow. The next time you pass an ancient fortress, don't just see a relic of battles past. See a testament to human creativity, a blueprint for solving problems with whatever tools are at hand, and a challenge to build our own futures with the same resourcefulness. Now it's your turn. What castle feature amazes you most? Is it the whispering walls that carried secrets, the arrow slits that defied physics, or the hidden wells that outwitted sieges? Drop your favorite example below, and let's keep unraveling the brilliance hidden in these stone puzzles together. After all, every discussion is another brick in the wall of understanding, and that's one fortress worth building.